Hello friendships, it's Alicia and I am back for another literature in review episode here where I'm going to be talking about a paper that really frustrated me when I first read it, and I'm not sure if it's going to continue to frustrate me now, but I'm going to go over the paper with you and tell you a couple of the things that I found out when investigating whether I ought to actually be frustrated or not. So in the last episode, I was talking about a couple of papers that looked at aspiration, pneumonia, and oral care. And this paper is one that I pulled while I was investigating the same general topic. So this one is called Cough Strength is an Indicator of Aspiration Risk when Restarting Food Intake in Elderly Subjects with Community-Acquired Pneumonia. So the first thing that happened to me when I read this is I got really confused just by the title because I wasn't sure why patients would be NPO due to community-acquired pneumonia. Fortunately, they addressed this in the paper, so if you were also confused about what I might be talking about just from the title, you're in company. I was going to say you're in good company, but that's extremely subjective. So the authors on this paper, we've got three. We've got Yasunari Sakai, S-A-K-A-I, Masayoshi Ohira, and Yoshiharu Yokokawa. And this is a paper with authors out of Japan. We've got Mr. Sakai, which is our second author, is affiliated with the Department of Rehabilitation in Shinsu University Hospital, Matsumoto, Japan. Mr. Ohira and Dr. Yokokawa are affiliated with the Department of Physical Therapy at Shinsu University School of Health Services, Matsumoto, Japan. So I think this is from the journal Respiratory Care. I don't know anything about it. I don't know that I've ever read a paper from this journal. I know nothing about it. But let's go ahead and talk over the abstract for this paper. So this paper is saying that in Japan, the incidence of community-acquired pneumonia, or CAP, is relatively high in elderly subjects. Cough peak flow, or peak cough flow, I think generally here in the United States, it's known as peak cough flow, PCF, is an objective indicator of cough strength, and a peak cough flow evaluation might be useful to assess whether food intake can be restarted. So they used peak cough flows, and they also did a swallow screener, which is the repetitive saliva swallowing test, and they looked at these. So what it says here in the abstract is that the repetitive saliva swallow test, which is a videoendoscopic evaluation of swallowing and is used to assess dysphagia and aspiration. So I think this is a little misleading here because I think the repetitive saliva swallowing test is actually a screening tool where you just palpate the lingual bone. That has to be the hyoid, right? And the thyroid cartilage, and you feel for the number of times the person has elevation of the thyroid cartilage over your finger in 30 seconds. So you're supposed to be figuring out how many times they've swallowed in 30 seconds. I did look that up because I wasn't sure what the RSST was. But that's not a FEES. That's not a video endoscopic swallow evaluation. So basically what they did was they looked to see whether the RSST, the screener I just mentioned, was able to identify aspiration, and they looked at whether the peak cough flow was able to identify aspiration. So I think the wording was just a little funky there. They're using the repetitive saliva swallow test, and they're using peak cough flows, and they're looking for the relationship between cut values on those two assessments and whether they actually saw aspiration on a video endoscopic swallow study. So they conclude ultimately here that there are cut points that you can use with given sensitivity and specificity to identify using these screeners when you would be more likely to find aspiration on an actual instrumental swallow assessment. So they said that the repetitive saliva swallowing test was predictive of aspiration with a sensitivity of 70% and a specificity of 71.7% if the person at 2.5 swallows, which I don't know how you would calculate a half swallow on the test, so it's not actually clear whether it would be 2 swallows or 3 swallows. So I'm not sure how super helpful that is, but the likelihood ratio would be 2.5, and negative likelihood ratio is 0.42. So this cut score is meant to identify people who are more likely to aspirate on an instrumental. And then for peak cough flows, they set a cut point of 190 liters per minute. And for this one, you had a higher sensitivity at 82.6%, but a slightly lower specificity at 69.4%. So what they concluded was that cough strength assessed with peak cough flow can be used as an indicator of aspiration risk in this particular patient population. Again, the patients they're talking about are older adults who are admitted to the hospital with community-acquired pneumonia. And they stated that looking at peak cough flow in this population was no worse than doing the repetitive saliva swallowing test. So yeah, very interesting. So, okay, so let's sort of dig into the stuff that I don't like about this study as we go through what's going on here. So in Japan, at this particular hospital, if you are admitted with a diagnosis of community-acquired pneumonia, to be cautious, all of the patients are made NPO, so they're not allowed to eat or drink. There's a rationale provided for this, I think, somewhere. Oh, okay, yeah. So they said that considering the potential for aspiration, many elderly patients with CAP, community-acquired pneumonia, are required to temporarily fast after admission to our hospital. And they look at the severity of dysphagia and the presence of aspiration using basically it's FEES, so it's an endoscopic swallow study, before restarting oral intake. And they say you should restart intake as soon as possible so that you're avoiding nutritional problems, dehydration, pulmonary issues, etc., while making sure to avoid aspiration when people already have pneumonia, it sounds like. So it says here that the study took place when restarting food intake 7 days after hospital admission in subjects with community-acquired pneumonia treated at Showa Inan General Hospital in Japan. Let me restate. This is where I got upset just in the very beginning of the study. It says, in the introduction, they say a previous study reported that the frequency of CAP or healthcare-associated pneumonia, i.e. aspiration pneumonia, was approximately 20% for people in their 50s, 50% among those in their 60s, 70% for those in their 70s, 80% in your 80s, and 90% in age groups over 90 years old. So where I take issue and where you're probably maybe also scratching your head is that they're saying a previous study reported that the frequency of community-acquired pneumonia or healthcare-associated pneumonia, also known as aspiration pneumonia. So we just got 3 different kinds of pneumonia bundled into one, I think, which would be community-acquired, healthcare-acquired, and aspiration pneumonia, which I think generally we're thinking of as being related to swallowing. So I looked there and I said, this is interesting. Okay, they have a citation. So I went and I looked at the list and I found this paper I wrote OMG next to it. So it's Teramoto 2008. And do I have that one? Do I? Yeah, this is the Teramoto paper. So this is actually a letter to the editor, published in March of 2008 in JAGS, which maybe I should look into what that is exactly. But the title of the article that they're citing here, or letter to the editor, it actually begins to the editor. It says, high incidence of aspiration pneumonia in community and hospital-acquired pneumonia in hospitalized patients, a multi-center prospective study in Japan. So it says we prospectively assess the prevalence of aspiration pneumonia in CAP and HAP, CAP meaning community-acquired pneumonia, and HAP meaning hospital-acquired pneumonia, in hospitalized patients in 22 hospitals in different areas of Japan. It looks like they had 589 patients. In the study, aspiration pneumonia was defined according to the Japanese Study Group on Aspiration Pulmonary Disease. They have a definition: pneumonia in a patient with a predisposition to aspiration because of dysphagia or swallowing disorders. Swallowing function in these patients was assessed using the water swallowing test, repetitive saliva swallowing test, simple swallowing provocation test, and video fluorography, so a video fluoroscopic swallow study. The swallowing function testing was used for the diagnosis of aspiration pneumonia. When swallowing function was not assessed using these examinations, the presence of overt symptoms of dysphagia or the medical history of aspiration was determined as swallowing disorders in this patient. Okay, so even if I don't get back to talking more about this first study, this is exactly why I'm going to need to do another podcast talking about the pulmonologists who reported on aspiration and different kinds of pneumonias in 2018 and 19, because this to me is very confusing. So I was talking to a former respiratory therapist yesterday at a conference, and I was asking, how is aspiration pneumonia differentially diagnosed from other kinds of pneumonia? And he said, well, I'm pretty sure it's been diagnosed functionally. Like if the person is suspected to have aspirated and they have pneumonia, boom, aspiration pneumonia. I don't know if anyone else listening is having problems with that, but in all of the different ways that in this letter to the editor, in all the different ways that they actually did swallowing assessments, quote unquote, they said they used the water swallowing test, repetitive saliva swallowing test, simple swallowing provocation test, and video fluorography. One of these is a way to visualize the swallow and see if a patient is actually aspirating, figure out why, etc. The others seem like screenings to me. Maybe you know something I don't. And it looks like if they didn't have any of these screeners or, video fluoro, they looked for overt symptoms of dysphagia or a medical history of aspiration. So if you have overt symptoms of dysphagia, could one of those be coughing? Wouldn't we expect coughing to be protective against aspiration pneumonia? I don't know. I'm really frustrated that it doesn't seem like we have a really great understanding of whether aspiration pneumonia is indeed a differential diagnosis or if it's simply a way of guessing how the pneumonia happened. Was it because of a swallowing disorder? So to me, that was pretty frustrating, and it looked like, okay, so here's where they're sort of getting their data. They say the incidence of aspiration pneumonia, which is really the incidence of either suspected or instrumentally shown aspiration in patients after they got pneumonia or potentially before if they had a history of aspiration, which if you aspirated when you had, a drug overdose when you were 24, and then you go into the hospital at age 56 and you have pneumonia, is that history of aspiration when you were 24, is that enough to now say that you have aspiration pneumonia? I'm not saying that that's probably common, but to me that seems a little misplaced. So in community-acquired pneumonia, they had either symptoms of dysphagia or failed a screening or had fluoro in 60% of those patients. And 86.7% of the patients with hospital-acquired pneumonia. Again, the way they're making that diagnosis, it just doesn't seem as medically reasonable as I thought it would be. I thought there would be some way to differentiate aspiration pneumonia from other kinds of pneumonia, but it seems like aspiration pneumonia is just what we call pneumonia in people who might have a swallowing problem, which means that it's not a dysphagia-caused aspiration pneumonia. It's the patient has pneumonia and then also has dysphagia. So how are we using dysphagia as a risk factor if we don't know whether they got... I don't know if you're as confused as I am. But I guess you can probably hear that I think it's kind of frustrating and definitely warrants a conversation further into this whole issue of how aspiration pneumonia is diagnosed and so forth. So let me know if you're interested in that. So when we're looking at this relationship between community-acquired pneumonia and aspiration pneumonia, whether you have a diagnosis of one or the other completely depends on whether the person doing your documentation put together that you had pneumonia and some sort of swallowing symptomology or not. If you didn't have someone look at swallowing, then you're getting diagnosed with community-acquired pneumonia. If somebody says you've got pneumonia and I'm trying to pick from a list and you also have a swallowing disorder, boom, I'm now giving you a different ICD code that says you have aspiration pneumonia. To me, that seems goofy, but I guess we'll dig into that later. So further to this study, we've got the repetitive saliva swallow test, and they used a cut score. In the past, it looks like the cut score has been reported with 81% sensitivity, 67% specificity, but they saw that there's a drawback to the RSST, which would not detect microaspiration or silent aspiration. It wouldn't actually detect any aspiration or penetration or anything about swallowing physiology whatsoever, but we know that. And then the peak cough flow, which they use doing the peak cough flow meter to see whether they could identify a cut score. And the cut score then would be compared with whether the patient did or did not aspirate when using a videoendoscopic evaluation of swallowing. Now, they did the fees. They did fees, and then they did a scoring system for fees, and I went to try to pull the study for that because they used cut scores of like 7, where if you had below 7, you had an unrestricted diet, and if you had above 7, subject of less than 7 would mean unrestricted oral intake, and then a score higher than 7 would mean you had to have some sort of altered diet. But I'm not familiar with that scale, so for me, I was a little bit puzzled, and I tried to pull. It looks like they were actually using a paper from Susan Langmore, 1991, for that scoring scale. I'm not familiar with it, but I never was trained to do fees independently, so maybe some of our fees friends could help with that. So again, they said less than 2.5 swallows. 23% of the subjects had unrestricted oral intake. And then if you had a peak cough flow of less than 190 liters per minute, only 11% of subjects had an unrestricted diet after doing the fees assessment. Now, I don't know what they did on the fees. I don't know what consistencies they tried, and I don't know whether patients would have been allowed to have non-modified diets if they were cognitively intact to try a strategy or anything like that. I've got no clue. But what's interesting is that once again, we've got a specific number for a cut score of peak cough flow, and they're suggesting that if the person has a peak cough flow greater than or equal to 190 liters per minute, and they have aspiration-related community-acquired pneumonia, they might be safe to start an oral diet. But if they have a lower peak cough flow, maybe they shouldn't start an oral diet. And I think they started checking people after 7 days of being in the hospital to see whether they could eat or drink again. Again, I'm not really sure of the rationale on that. And I'm also not sure if you're a clinician and you're hearing for the repetitive saliva swallow test, less than 2.5 swallows gives you about 23% of subjects who can actually have something safe. They can have an unrestricted oral diet. The other question I have is that what if they have somewhat of a restricted oral intake, but they're safe with all of the modified consistencies? I'm not sure. They said something here about glottic closure being involved in both cough strength and swallow functions. And so that might have been a problem in both using the repetitive saliva swallow test and the peak cough flows. But I'm not really sure. I think I've read somewhere that the compression phase and complete compression of the vocal folds is not necessary to a cough. And I also know that complete closure of the arytenoids is not necessarily essential to a swallow. For example, if you were to have complete and timely epiglottic inversion, it might not matter whether your arytenoids were completely adducted. So I'm not really positive about that. They do overall make it a case that you should look at peak cough flow, and it might be beneficial if you also paired it with a swallowing screener. In this case, again, it was the repetitive saliva swallowing test, which I also did look into. It does not seem to necessarily vary depending on the amount of saliva you have in your mouth. Because one of the studies I looked at trying to validate that assessment, we're looking at that. I think they did say that men could swallow more times in 30 seconds than women could. Again, the RSST would be a screener at best because simply palpating the larynx does not tell you whether someone swallowed. And if the person gets laryngeal elevation, that does not necessarily mean that they swallowed at all. It doesn't tell you anything other than that the larynx was elevated. And also, since we all have different sized fingers, I'm not sure that this idea of having sufficient elevation over your middle finger means the person actually swallowed or not. So those are sort of some of the problems I had with it. I don't think it's out of place to suggest that if you are waiting to get your instrumental assessment, if you were to do both a cough screener and a swallow screener, they might tell you whether you need to get into fluoro faster. But again, the specific patient population here was patients over age 65 who were admitted to the hospital with, air quotes, community-acquired pneumonia. Some of those are assumed to be the same as aspiration pneumonia. So on that note, I think it might be reasonable for the physicians to have their patients be NPO, but having them wait 7 days to start eating again without knowing whether their pneumonia has anything to do with dysphagia, I think that could be problematic. I don't know. If you know anything more, if you've seen patients in this population, if you have any additional thoughts, please leave a comment. Let me know. You can always reach me at my email addresses at the University of Florida. I'm alicia.reve@ufl.edu. I'm also alicia.reve@gmail if you would prefer to email an account that does not go on the Florida Public Record. My name is ALYCIA.RIVET for both of those emails. So I hope this was somehow helpful for you. Again, if you would like the paper so that you can read it yourself and discuss further, please let me know. Send me an email to either of those places and I will get back to you with a copy of the manuscript so that we can both read it, discuss it, and see what you think. For now, that's it, and I will hope to talk to you more about this soon, and I also will plan on doing a dedicated podcast to the topic of aspiration pneumonia from the perspective of a pulmonologist who would be the person diagnosing what kind of pneumonia if you are getting a differential diagnosis in the first place. So thanks for hanging out, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.